State is actually not a React-specific concept, but it is a key concept in React as well. And here in expense item, we have a scenario where we want to use that built-in state concept. Because this title here, which changes when the click handler executes, is actually data that should result in this component being re-evaluated and redrawn on the screen when it changes, when that title data changes. And by default, regular variables like this one are not triggering such a re-evaluation. React doesn't care about that. If you have a variable in your component function and that variable changes, React ignores it. It doesn't care about that. That code executes, sure, but the overall component function doesn't execute again just because some variable changed. And as a side note, even if it would execute again, of course, then title, this variable, would also just be recreated and reinitialized to the props value, because as part of this component function, we are creating this title variable. So even if that would happen, we wouldn't reach the desired result, but we don't even need to think about that because it is not happening. This expense item component function currently is not called a second time after the initial rendering. Just because a click occurred or because a variable changed does not trigger this component function to run again. So to tell React that it should run it again, we need to import something from the React library. And we do this by adding a so-called named import. This here is the default import. Now we can add a comma and curly braces, and between the curly braces, we can now extract specifically named things from the React library. Here we import the overall React object. Now we want to import single pieces from the React library. And we want to import a function here, a function which is called useState. This is a function provided by the React library, and this function allows us to define values as state, where changes to these values should reflect in the component function being called again, which is a key difference to the regular variable we're using here. Now, how do we use this useState function, though? Well, it's very simple. Inside of our component function, and that's important, we have to do that inside of this function, we just call useState. And useState is a so-called React hook. There are other hooks as well, and of course we are going to learn about all important hooks throughout this course, but that is one of the most important ones. And all these React hooks can be recognized by the fact that they start with the word use in their name, and all these hooks must only be called inside of React component functions, like expense item. They can't be called outside of these functions, like this, and they also shouldn't be called in any nested functions. They must be called directly inside such component functions. There is one exception, which I'll talk about later, but for the moment, that is what you should keep in mind. Now, useState doesn't work just like that. Instead, useState wants a default state value. Because with useState, we basically create a special kind of variable, you could say. A variable where changes will lead this component function to be called again. And of course, we can therefore assign an initial value for that special variable, just as we're assigning a value here for this regular variable. So here my initial value is props.title, and we simply pass this as an argument to useState. Now this special variable is created. Of course, we also want to be able to use that variable. We want to be able to use it down here, for example, and therefore useState also returns something. It gives us access to this special variable. However, it does not just return that. It also returns a function which we can then call to assign a new value to that variable. So we'll not be assigning values like this with the equal sign. Instead, we will be assigning new values by calling a function. That's just how this state variable thing works. And for that, useState actually returns an array where the first value is the variable itself, you could say, the value itself, and the second element in the array is that updating function. And we can use a modern JavaScript feature called array destructuring, which looks like this, to store both elements in separate variables or constants. And here I'll use constants. And I'll come back to why it's a constant in a second. Now you can choose any names of your choice, because for array destructuring, it's just the order which matters. And I'll name this title and set title. The first element, as I just said, is a pointer at that managed value. So initially at props title, the value stored in props title. And the second element here is a function which we can later call to set a new title, hence this name which I chose. Both names are up to you, but the convention is to use something which describes the value as a name for this first element, since that is the value, and then set, and then that name repeated, just with a capital starting character here, this capital T, for that function which updates the value. That's the convention on how you name these two elements returned by useState. And useState, this hook, always returns an array with exactly two elements. That's always the case, and it's always the case that the first element is the current state value, and the second element is a function for updating that. Now with that, we can remove that title variable, and we can also remove that value assignment in ClickHandler. And we can still use title like this down there in JSX. So if we now save it like this, we still see toilet paper here. So that hasn't changed. But of course the button still doesn't do anything, because at the moment we're never updating this. Now as I said, with the value returned by useState, we're not going to assign a new value with an equal sign. Instead, we assign a new value by calling setTitle, so by calling this state updating function. And then we just pass the new value as an argument, in this case, updated. Now, why does it work like this though? Why do we have this state updating function instead of assigning a new value like this? The reason for that is that calling this function does not just assign a new value to some variable, but that instead this is a special variable to begin with. It's managed by React somewhere in memory, and when we call this state updating function, this special variable will not just receive a new value, but, and that's important, the component function in which you called this state updating function and in which you initialized your state with useState will be executed again. And that is exactly what we need. We want to call this component function again when our state changes. And by calling this state updating function, that's happening. Because by calling this function, you're telling React that you want to assign a new value to this state, and that then also tells React that the component in which this state was registered with useState should be re-evaluated. And therefore React will go ahead and execute this component function again, and therefore also evaluate this JSX code again. And then it will draw any changes which it detects compared to the last time it evaluated this onto the screen. So if we now save everything, if I click change title, you see the title changes to updated for the expense item in which we're doing this. And that's now how this works. Now you will notice that these console logs still show the title before it was updated. The reason for this is that calling this state updating function actually doesn't change the value right away, but instead schedules this state update. So in the very next line thereafter, this new value isn't available yet. That's why we see the old value being logged even though we updated it before logging. But you do see that eventually this component is called again and is evaluated again, and that therefore we see our updated value on the screen. That's how React State works, and this is another key concept in React. If you have data which might change, and where changes to that data should be reflected on the user interface, then you need state. Because regular variables will not do the trick. With state, however, you can set and change values, and when they do change, React will re-evaluate the component in which the state was registered. And only that component, by the way, not any other components, just this component in which this state was registered. Now let's take a closer look at this state and why we use const and how this all works in detail.